that we're going to do a couple little spoilers. There are a couple little things that I want to know about having read the book. So we're going to do a little spoiler session at the very end of the conversation, but I'll give everybody plenty of warning before we head into that. So if you want to tune out, you can do that. So Samantha, sorry to have you sitting there while I'm rambling on, but let me just real quick give an introduction to everybody about who you are, and we'll jump right in. So Samantha Silva is an author and screenwriter based in Idaho. Over her career, she's sold film projects to Paramount, Universal, New Line Cinema, and TNT. A film adaptation of her short story, The Big Burn, won her a wonderful prize at the Sun Valley Film Festival in 2017. So not only was this book published in 2017, she won that short film award in 2017. So we're going to talk a little bit about your film career too a little bit later. She graduated from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where she studied in Bologna, Italy, and Washington, D.C. She's lived in London 3 times, briefly in Rome, is an avid Italophile, I love that, and a forever Dickens devotee. So welcome, Samantha.
Thank you for having me, Julie.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you. It was one of those things when I first, when I saw that it was paperback and I was getting into the holiday spirit, we were doing these virtual things, and I was just like, I wonder if there's any way that we could get Samantha to come on around Christmas time and talk about this book. So glad you're here. So let's start off with, tell us about the book and what inspired you to write it. Big general question.
Okay. So I actually started as a writer, as a screenwriter. And, many, many years ago, my kids were tiny and I was, trying to figure out how to write screenplays. And a friend of mine called me and said, we ought to write a ghost story anthology movie about Dickens writing The Carol, because she'd heard that that's how he came up with it. And the Victorians loved ghost stories and telling them around the hearth. Well, when I looked into it, that wasn't actually how he came up with The Carol at all. And so we let it drop. And about 2 years later, I literally woke up one morning, sat bolt upright in bed, and I knew the entire story, start to finish, that is this book now. But it started as a screenplay. I wrote the screenplay, and almost immediately with it got an agent. And over the course of the next 10 or 12 years, we optioned the rights to the screenplay to 4 different companies.
Wow.
Here and in Europe. And all 4 times, we'd have actors attached or a director or put some of the money, and all 4 times had heartbreaking near misses with the big screen.
Well, because that's the thing that I don't think people understand with movies, is that it's not just as simple as, oh, there's a movie deal. There's so much involved in, like you said, the money, having what actors are thought about, attaching people to it. It's just a whole other world trying to get a screenplay.
It really is. Yeah, the movie business is tough. And so I finally, after living with it so many years as a screenplay, I thought, well, I know the story works because we keep selling it. We keep selling the plot, basically. But I really wanted it to have a life. And so I thought, well, I'll try my hand at novel writing.
And you had never written anything like that before?
No, I'd written some short fiction.
Okay.
But never anything long form. And you think, oh, I ought to be able to figure this out. And then you realize it's much harder, because screenwriting is in so many ways the opposite of novel writing.
I was going to talk to you about that a little bit later, because it was just like, or we could talk about it now, because that is something that I don't think people realize either, just how different those, and that's why, because a lot of when people sell their books, people assume that the author is going to be the screenwriter, and that's not necessarily, because it is a completely different sort of medium, right?
Yes, and I think I had to unlearn what I knew as a screenwriter and what the discipline was. And the way I figured it out is that in screenwriting, you're really creating a blueprint for a film. It's all about economy, efficiency. There's nothing superfluous on the page that you won't see on the screen. You can't talk about the interior life of a character in a screenplay. You rely on action, dialogue, and the performance of the actor. And so if you're lucky enough to get a movie made, you've got this incredible crew of people who are production designers and set dressers and costumers and all these.
Who are making that story come alive for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, it took me a long time to realize that as a novelist, you have all those jobs. all of that has to be on the page.
Right.
And in addition to those, the details and the texture and the layering and the weather and the setting and all of those things, there's such a big responsibility as a novelist to creating an interior life and the sort of arc of the emotional arc of the character that you do in a screenplay rely so much on performance.
Right.
And
I think in the novel too, it's like, and you can't overdo that. And that's what you've done so well in this, is that you put us into this time period in in a way that, it's not a 500-page novel, but you're there and you feel it. And that's one of the things, like I read this as a galley in 2017, and they still have the feeling of the book this many years later, 3 years later. And so that's a testament to your writing ability too. But that's something that
I appreciate that. I'm so glad you feel that way. And I do think that because I cut my teeth as a screenwriter, I do, my instinct is always restraint. And in fact, it took me three years. Each draft took a year of going a little bit deeper and giving myself permission to really explore those things and the inky deeps and find the texture and the layers. And so it was never about reeling it back in, which
okay, interesting. Okay, yeah, that's
really
yeah,
about being more
keep adding,
expansive and being richer and being sort of more willing to do that kind of work and take on all those jobs that normally you don't have as a screenwriter.
Okay, so we went from a ghost story to the real story. So I sidetracked you a little bit on screenwriting. So let's we'll take you back to the
I love talking about it.
I know I find it very fascinating, and I have a feeling that some of our viewers will find, I find that very fascinating, the two different types of writing. But so back to the story, and so you knew immediately that you had it. It wasn't the ghost story; it was the real reason why he wrote the book.
Yeah. So the actual story, the true story of Dickens is that he was a literary rock star of his time. Everyone knew him, and from illiterates to the wealthiest Londoners knew him by name, and he was beloved. He was the greatest living writer in the English language at the time, and he really he was such a sort of rising star that he'd never really suffered a failure. It was always more money, bigger houses, more children, a more lavish life, and also more philanthropy for him, in addition to his responsibility for his dad and his brother and his relatives and friends of relatives. And, every beggar and charity in London knew him as an easy mark. And I think that's exactly right. So anyway, Martin Chuzzlewit, he writes, is an utter flop. And so in real life, his publishers, Chapman and Hall, did go to him and say, sorry, dude, but we're going to be deducting from your pay 40 pounds sterling on a monthly basis. And, and he thought that would ruin him. And so in real life, Dickens thought, I need a money spinner. And so, I'm going to write a Christmas book, about a miser because I need a money spinner. So, which I think is such a great irony. I love it.
I love that.
Yeah, but so the true story is he had a big money problem. He had an idea, as Dickens always did, and solved it. And there's no conflict in that. There's no obstacle in that.
Right.
But I loved the idea that his publishers would go to him and try to blackmail him into writing a Christmas book. Yeah. And there you have conflict, and that sort of, changes his trajectory and sets him off on a journey where he can actually have his own sort of inner Scrooge.
Right.
Journey and arc, and and ultimately, even though he takes a lot of wrong turns, ultimately is inspired to write the book that we know of as A Christmas Carol.
And when you were writing, so you came up, so you had that as the catalyst of the conflict that came. Did you have the idea of the Muse right away as well?
Yes, again, I somehow had all of it, and I love the idea of a muse, and I realize now. I think, let me backtrack. I think writers take on projects whether they know it or not. They're working out usually some kind of interior, psychological or emotional problem. And sometimes we disguise it as an intellectual problem, but we're really trying to figure out,
what's going on in there.
Exactly in our own lives. And so we create this, giant canvas of other people to help us. Like, it's like playing with dolls. It's like, working,
right. Working out all these problems.
Everybody, yeah. So you can work out your inner conflict. But I think that, I realized along the way that Dickens is this character, as flawed as he is, he really does. He's this larger than life, charismatic, brilliant, talented, incredible man who has a heart as big as the world. And I realized, oh my God, I've been attracted to that man all my life, starting with my father, who was that kind of man. And then I married one. And now I'm going to live with Dickens, for
forever.
20 years. Yeah. And so, but I also think that, there's some aspect of that where, I think I played a muse. I think, early in my marriage, I sort of played the role of muse.
Okay.
And you realize pretty quickly that it's, it's a great gig if you can get it, but it can never last, because a muse, it can never be her own person and have her own agency and her own ambitions and desires. And as soon as those rear their ugly head, like, the whole muse thing is up.
So, yeah, the gig is up.
Yeah, the gig is up. So I really liked the idea. And of course, the idea of a muse is that, we always look for an external inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
We look for something outside of ourselves. And the muse is always on the inside. And so, when I teach, screenwriting, I always talk about Wizard of Oz because everyone's seen it. And, people think that the story, the theme of Wizard of Oz is about, there's no place like home, but it isn't at all. That was a complete Hollywoodization of the Baum book. And really, it's about a young woman, young person, coming to understand that the adults around her are inadequate to the task of saving her. And she has to assume her own power to save herself.
It's so true.
Yeah, so true. Yeah. And so, I mean, in a way, it's the same thing is true for the Dickens story. I mean, he gets alienated from himself, as a grown man, and from the things that matter to him the most. And he has to find his way back, sort of to the inner, his own inner spirit that can help him write this book.
Yeah. And I mean, and during that time period, I mean, I think that I'm assuming, you could correct me in this, but I'm assuming there's a lot written about Dickens. And so sifting through all that, was there ever any indication that there really was a muse, or is that strictly just out of your brain?
Actually, Dickens did believe in muses, yes.
Okay.
And the Maria Beadnell character is completely real.
Okay.
That really, she was his first love, and he was head over heels. He wanted to marry her and have a life with her, and she spurned him. Basically, she sort of came from money, and her father thought Dickens didn't have prospects and really wasn't a good choice for her. And so, he believed that in some ways his unrequited love and Maria Beadnell's rejection of him sort of inspired his writing life, because he wanted to prove to her that he was good enough. And in fact, he was. So,
yeah. Turned out that he actually was.
Yeah. So I mean, in that sense, it's in a way, a kind of a negative muse for him, that he thought the rejection was, powered him. But I think Dickens was always looking for a muse.
Yeah. And back to the vast amount of information that there is about Dickens. Was there anything that you were intimidated by on taking him on and taking this beloved story on? Was there ever like that moment of, whoa, am I really doing this?
Completely. Imposter syndrome every single day. But I think, and especially, I have such esteem and regard for the biographers and the people who've written. I mean, the incredible Peter Ackroyd, Claire Tomlin. I mean, the best, greatest biographers in the world have taken Dickens on. And, you sort of bow down to them and, apologize and say sorry for the liberties that I've taken, but thank you so much for, teaching me who Dickens was. But I do think, again, it's it's something, and it's, there's another aspect of being an American taking on a British, such a,
Oh yeah, I didn't even think about that aspect of it too. Yeah, that's a whole other aspect of it.
yeah, an absolute giant. But this is an aside, but when you're pitching the book, people often want to know, well, what is it like? What, where does this book sit on the shelf? And I always said, well, if Shakespeare in Love had been a book before it had been a movie, that's where it sits on the shelf. Right. And so in some ways, I also revere Tom Stoppard, and that would never, I bow down to Tom Stoppard, right, who wrote, I think, the last draft of the screenplay that got made. But I think giving yourself freedom, permission to play is really important. And there's a lot of playfulness in this. And I have to say that I did have moments, as I said, when I was first writing the screenplay, my kids were really young, and I would get up at 5 or in the morning when it was still dark and run down to the computer so I could type. And I had so often sort of being in that that liminal space of not quite conscious,
not quite awake, and it's dark outside, and
my first cup of coffee, that I really often had the feeling that I was just taking dictation. Wow. And and I don't, I think I thought then that's what writing is, and I haven't had that experience.
Oh,
it's been very frustrating to me. But
somebody's not telling you their story in your ear.
Tell me what to say. So I sort of, in some ways, even though it was so intimidating, I really felt like I was being told how to move my fingers to write the words.
Well, it really feels so Dickensian in its just feel and everything about it. The way you write about the time period, the streets of London, everything. So in your research, I'm sure that there was but living in London had to have been very helpful in that too, as far as you imagining what the streets were like and what everything was like too.
Yeah, I often say it's, remarkable because London's become such a modern, city, but it's a layer over the Victorian city. London is still so much the Victorian city that it was, and you don't have to squint your eyes very much at all to see it. And so often you walk on the exact same cobblestones that Dickens walked on. So, and the street names are the same, and
wow,
there's so much Victorian architecture. So that was a big inspiration for me. And I love London very much. So
and one of the things that you mentioned too before was that, everybody knew him, from the pauper to, and that I believe was a testament to Queen Victoria at the time, and educating and making sure that everybody was educated and could read. And so everybody at some point knew his stories, or, and that's how he became so famous, correct? That was.
Yes, although I'd actually give Dickens more or as much, credit as Queen Victoria. Certainly that was, the Victorian idea, but Dickens was serializing his novels, and he was one of the first serializers, and he wanted so people could afford to read them, and buy them, and even illiterates would gather around, and someone would read to 20 people who were gathered in the gin shop to hear the newest monthly number, because they came out the first of the month, the new edition, and so that was a huge thing for literacy, because people were motivated to read, wanted to be able to read Dickens' story. And the other thing that I think is so important is that it was the first time that people in London who didn't have money thought their stories were being told. And that's why they were interested in them. They felt like this is who we are. And they knew, everyone knew Dickens had all his inspiration from the street. He was a great mimic. Every character, every person he met in the street really was a potential character. And he wrote with a mirror always. He memorized facial expressions and, in dialect and this and that. And so they recognized themselves and their world in his writing. And that was a huge boon to literacy in England.
Wow. And so to back to the Christmas aspect of it, and A Christmas Story. So was that, there was also, I think, something in that celebrating Christmas was sort of back in fashion or becoming. And so was that why he wrote A Christmas Story, or is that just speculative as far as why he wrote the Christmas story?
Well, the odd thing is, we talk about the war on Christmas, but it was actually in England the Puritans who had a war on Christmas. They really thought it was a somber holiday, and there should not be singing and and joy and celebration and food and all of that kind of thing. And so Dickens, people credit him with reinventing Christmas, but for him, it was a season of being reminded of what matters and our responsibilities to each other and our blessings and our all the sort of the spiritual values that we hold so dear. And he wrote about these people as well, these English people that hadn't been really written about before,
Mm-hmm.
celebrating Christmas and how they did in their families and what it meant, and and the ways in which they still held these values that were really important. And so it sort of revived Christmas, and some of these Christmas traditions really come from that era. In fact, the thing about Victoria and Albert, because Albert was German, having trees inside the house, that's true.
Yeah.
And Christmas cards, were invented around this time, holiday cards. And so a lot of it really does come from this era. And you can attribute certainly some of it to Dickens. I think this was the first Christmas, it was certainly the first Christmas book he wrote.
Okay.
And he'd never written a book all in at one time.
Right, because they were all serialized. Right.
Done journalism, sketches by Boz, but there were many Christmas stories after this, and so he clearly loved it.
And he clearly led the way. Yeah.
Yes,
And I'm
yes.
looking at your Christmas tree behind you, so it's like it's feeling very Christmassy with Dickens and a Christmas tree in the background, and I'm just loving it. It's getting us all in the Christmas spirit. For this.
I love to talk about Dickens around this time, and of course it's in many ways it's not a Christmas book, because not only a Christmas book, because all of these things are the values that Dickens held most dear and wrote about most often in all of his books. But this is the one that people keep coming back to, because it so distills, I think, our actual experience.
Well, and it fills us with, some of his other stories kind of not they bring us down, but they're showing a side of life that is very hard, and where this one, even though he shows hard parts of life, it's filled with this hope and this spirit that and I think that's what everybody wants to grab onto at this time of year.
Yes, and I think, I hope this comes through in my book as well, and the ending of the book, which is that we can't all live in perfect awareness and be perfect people all year round. It's just not our nature to have that kind of, complete awareness of how lucky we are, how fortunate we are, what our blessings are, where our gratitude lies, what our responsibilities are, our sort of generosity of spirit. You just can't be that the whole year round. And so, I think we all look to these holidays,
Mm-hmm.
this holiday season, to bring us closer, to have those crystalline moments of pure awareness about, the things we love and the things that matter, and our responsibilities to, each other and our communities.
Right. And especially this year, even though we're all going to be separated from each other, most of us will be, it's even more a time of being reflective of that and appreciative of what we all mean to each other and ways to show that to each other.
I really agree.
Okay. So back to the research and everything. Was there anything that two-part question to this one. Was there anything that you discovered that was like, that you hadn't, because if you're, that would just surprised you about your research about Dickens? And then was there anything that you left out of the book that you wanted to put in?
Oh, wow. Well, again, I was lucky that I knew the story, because the bones were there. And again, because I started as a screenwriter, I consider myself, more as a writer, they say, are you a plotter or a pantser?
Right.
Do you have the seat of your pants? And I'm a big plotter, and I'm in a writing group with some other writers, and some of them are pantsers, and it just makes me so anxious.
It's like, what if you get to that dead end? What happens when you get to and you have to throw all that work away?
Yeah. So I always had that as a skeleton of the story, and I knew that in writing the novel, I was really, putting like sinew and, and fat and all that, and all those juicy things on the skeleton that was already there. But certainly, going back to the idea of Dickens as a complicated, flawed man, I mean, the more you read about him, everyone has this idea of sort of the wonderful Dickens, but he's a really complicated guy. And controversial in some ways. It's controversial that he later left his wife and fell in love with an actress, and wasn't always a perfect father. And so I think those were things that were surprising to me. And and then you also realize, God, he's human.
Right.
Isn't like, just because he lives in a different century, it doesn't mean he doesn't have.
You don't have those desires, and those things are still within us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are the same across time, and I think that's where historical fiction can be so much fun. To connect us across time and see that yes, the circumstances, the historical circumstances are different, but we're human beings across time, with the same desires. And so I think, and really, the more you discover about a character, his or her flaws and complications, the richer the work becomes, just by nature. That's the gold that you mine. That's the stuff that makes it interesting.
Right.
And
and the flaws in the characters are but you don't want to like turn the people off. There's supposed to be this endearing part of them, that you have to like grab onto too,
And I think that's a thin line. I mean, when I don't think this is too much of a spoiler alert, but he does alienate sort of before he figures out what he's going to do. He alienates everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody. And so it is, you have to sort of be at that point already grounded with him, that you're going to go on this journey with him.
Yeah.
Even though he's going to be a jerk.
Good, bad, or indifferent, you're on the journey with him.
So it is a lot about grounding the character in his own sort of emotional soup. So you're sort of willing to go on that journey, and it's going to be difficult.
No. I'm looking at my questions here because there were so many that I had that I've got to make sure that I can try to squeeze in as many here. But one of them was the secondary characters. We won't get into the Muse or anything like that yet. We'll save that for the spoiler discussion for those that want to stay in with us. But the secondary characters are so rich too. His dad, Thackeray, I mean, in the bars and stuff. So was that fun researching and fleshing those characters out too? And was Thackeray as big of a cat as he seemed in the bar?
Oh my God. Well, I have to say, a lot of it is, you didn't have to make very much up. I mean, Forster, in fact, I love the dinner scene where they're all sitting around Thackeray and the Wilkie Collins and the Trollops and the Carlyles. Those, are very much things they actually said about Dickens.
Wow.
And so they were all friends, and they had dinner together, and they were rivals.
Right.
Well. And so all the things, Thackeray is his biggest rival, and is always trashing Dickens for writing these, sappy, sentimental novels.
Yeah.
But then, of course, when Carol comes out, Thackeray's the one who says, whatever differences we've had, this book you've written is a national benefit, kindness to every man and woman and a national benefit. And I could never write anything like it. And so there just, isn't very much that you had to make up. And John Forster is a character I really loved writing. There's so much about him and letters between them. And so it's the research is there. I mean, you don't have to do very much.
Yeah.
To make Forster feel.
It's very rich.
Yeah, very rich. And also, I think just psychologically that in some ways, John Forster the friend, some of these characters operate as parts of Dickens' psyche.
Mm-hmm.
Forster's like the ghost of Christmas present, like
Mm-hmm.
pages, we need pages.
Right. We need pages, right
and,
now.
And his father is sort of the, the ghost of Christmas past.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And then the Muse is,
right.
The
right where we're at, what to come. So I'm gonna save some time to do some spoilers. So before we do that though, I want to close it out a little bit for people who don't want to stay with us for the spoilers. So couple quick things. So this year in the shutdown, are you currently writing? Is there something that you feel you could tell us about if something's coming, or what have you been doing during this to fill your time during the shutdown?
Well, weirdly, I've been kind of struggling with a second novel for about 3 years, and then only struggling because it's historical fiction again. And I took a big, major literary figure, Mary Wollstonecraft, who's the mother of Mary Shelley, mother of feminism, a huge character, and writing a novel of her life, which is, again, much more difficult because with Dickens, I had this jewel of a 6-week period where he's writing a carol and just could play with that. And this was sort of trying to understand how I find the plot of someone's, entire existence.
Right.
So, but weirdly, even though I've been struggling and kind of, dragging with it, when the pandemic hit, I just sat down and wrote that thing, and I finished it.
Fantastic.
And I realized that for me, the work became an escape, and history became an escape for me, and I wanted from doom scrolling and worrying and
right.
all of that awful stuff, and it was really like to lose myself in another period was so great and rich. And also in some ways it gives you perspective, like, oh, there is a sweep of history, and we're in it. Right. And day to day, this is really difficult, but this is the sweep of history.
Yeah.
And
so, we will come through it at the other end. We get so mired in, but that must have been super cathartic to just like write that through. Cause like you said, the doom scrolling, we all just like went.
Yeah.
So you probably didn't do much reading outside of your research then, or were there any books?
I've been so 18th century, late 18th century, reading about the revolution in the 1789 revolution in Paris. It's hard. I mean, I do, so reading contemporary literature now is such a little treat that I give myself, when I can. But when people say, oh, what books have you been reading lately? It's, really want to know.
It's like, and it's stuff that you may not even be hard to find. Warwick's probably doesn't have it on the shelf. So
yeah, but I have, read some fantastic books, and that's also an escape for me, is to read contemporary literature.
Now you live in Idaho, and maybe I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but did you ever read Idaho by Emily Ruskovich?
Yes, and I've met Emily, and I thought it was such a beautiful book.
I loved that book. I read that in a galley too. That was one of those that was just sitting on the shelf, and I loved the cover, and I was like, oh, this one looks fantastic.
The cover's gorgeous. And it really, I have to say that it was reminiscent for me of Marilyn Robinson. And I think, in fact, she may have studied with Marilyn Robinson at Iowa, but she is such a talented writer.
She's a great writer, but yeah. And speaking of great covers, I'm sorry, I'm so glad that they kept this cover for the paperback too. I love this cover. It's just like, it just says it all. Okay, so we're going to go into just a couple little spoiler questions. So fair warning to everybody that if you don't want, because the beauty of a book is discovering. I'm not a flap reader. I usually don't read the back of a book. It's either I'm one of those people that judges a book by its cover, or, there's some little thing that will attract me to a book that I read it. And I want an author to tell me their story. I don't want somebody else's impression of the story. So, so anyways, we're going to get into some spoilers though now. So if you want to preserve your reading pleasure and you haven't read this yet, you might want to tune out. You can always come back to us later after you finish the book and see what we talked about with the spoilers. This will be on YouTube as well, so you can hit our YouTube channel to see it too. So fair warning, everybody, we're going to get into some spoilers now. So if we say goodbye to a few of you. So I was not one of those. We talked a little bit in the green room about the Muse, and I was not one of those that realized. So I was totally enraptured with the whole what you laid out for me. So did you know that you were going to do that with the Muse?
Yes.
You did.
I did know. Do you want me to say it?
Yes.
It's very near the end of the book, and the Muse, Eleanor Lovejoy, ends up being a ghost. She's a woman who died a year ago, the very night that is the last night that they say goodbye after he's finished the carol. And I did. I mean, again, that was part of the story that was gifted to me. And she's such a great character to write. And I, in a strange way, I mean, there are rules of the ghost world which you have to be so careful about, and you have to, I mean, there aren't rules like a recipe book. You make your own rules, but then you have to be consistent with them.
Right.
So it's very tricky, and a lot of people went back and read it a second time, and they were like, "Oh, I see how you did that."
Okay.
Never touch. She never speaks to anyone else.
Right.
They're just little clues that are there that you could piece together.
Very much. What was it? The Sixth Sense? What was that book? I mean, the movie.
Right.
Very much. Sure.
Exactly. The clues are there, and I think it's pretty consistent throughout. But we talked about the Muse and the function of the Muse, and what was really important to me was that, in fact, he thinks she's the Muse, and she lets him believe that. But she is a Muse with her own agency and her own agenda for her son. Mm-hmm. And that's really what she's all about. But she knows that to get there, she has to sort of be a spirit guide for him through this these obstacles on the way to writing a carol. And so I liked doing that as well, like having a Muse who, of course, isn't a Muse, and who, in the end says the inspiration is inside you. You know what this book is. You just need to write it. So
it just made it all feel like it's just like we all kind of have that inner voice that is something that we believe is out there.
Yes.
It was such a great, just like, was that perfect, that perfect thing at the end of the book. Loved it.
I'm so glad. And it's I like the moment when they say goodbye to each other. And I like the moment when, he realizes the implications of her being a ghost. And it's sort of the final thing that propels him out of his own selfishness. Mm-hmm. In order to open his eyes to what's right in front of him and the pain right in front of him. Yeah. So it's a great. I mean, a ghost is always a device,
right? But
to give her as much of her own, interior life.
Right. No, she was a fully fleshed out ghost.
I'm glad you. That was my intention.
Yeah, she was a fully fleshed out ghost, but it was so great. And it was like you said, I mean, as giving as he was still selfish. I mean, there was a lot, like you said, we talked about, he's human. He's that's a flawed character. Okay. My eyes are going to go a little weird right now on you, because I'm going to go out to Facebook and see if we've got any questions that have come through. So bear with me 1 second while this loads up here. So let's see here. Where are we? Oh, well, maybe there aren't. Sorry,
that's okay.
Yeah,
there's always this.
Oh, there's always like some technical thing that goes on, and now I can't even find where we're out. There we are. I was like, where are we? I know that we're live on here, so there we are. Okay. So got a lot of questions, looks like. So the first one is, which character was your favorite to write? That's come from Starla.
Oh, okay, Starla. Well, it has to be Dickens, but he's just, he keeps on giving. He's so complicated and deep and amazing and funny, and there was just so much material about him. But probably, oh God, I don't know. It's hard. I really like the relationship between Dickens and John Forster. Apart from Eleanor the Muse, I mean, it's very, she's the character I relate to the most, probably.
Right.
But John Forster is a character I really, really love. It was fun to write him. And when it was going to be a movie, you could see there were so many great actors who could be John Forster, the kind of James Cordens of the world.
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure.
Or there's so many great English actors who could pull that off.
Oh yeah, that James Corden I think would have been fantastic. That was what that would have. Yeah, that totally just like popped. It was like, oh yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the next one is Amanda was so funny. You said she must have been watching earlier when she said, wait, where am I here? You literally shot up in bed with a fully formed plot line in your head, question mark, exclamation point. And did it come to you like in a dream like Paul McCartney and Yesterday? Was it your own ethereal muse?
That's a great question. When those things happen, again, I've never had that experience again. And so you don't look the gift horse in the mouth. You're just like suddenly whether, it felt like it had been gifted to me in a dream. I just kind of, woke up and there it was. I knew the shape of it and the major plot points, and it was enough. It was so revivifying,
Right.
and propelled me to write, to sit down and spend the next year writing the entire screenplay. So I hope I have that experience again.
Yeah.
It really spoiled me.
I know. I was going to say now it's like actual work now, where before it was probably felt like, oh, this really isn't work. This is just storytelling.
Exactly.
Now it's that thing called work.
I appreciate the question. And I'm not. It really was like that. So I have no explanation for it. I really don't know why that happened.
Right. Like we said, that's your own muse in that one.
Yeah.
And then Caroline says Samantha needs to finish her next book. Can't wait until does. So
that's so nice. And I am done. It'll come. It's called Love and Fury, a novel of Mary Wollstonecraft, and it will be out also Flatiron Books.
Okay.
It's publishing it, which I'm very excited about, and it will be out in May, late May, May 25th.
Fantastic. Hopefully we can have you back to talk about that.
I would love that. It's much different. I have to say it's much different tonally. I mean, I really think of Dickens as, kind of comic, sentimental novel in the spirit of Dickens. And this is a much different thing, but it was a privilege to write it, honestly, and to know what I know about Mary Wollstonecraft. So I hope people turn to it.
Can't wait. I'll have to get my hands on an early copy of that.
Oh, but you will.
I have to get my hands on it. That's the perks of doing this job, is like, ooh, get to look at things a little bit early. So I'll have to see if I can get my hands on one of those.
And I have to say that I was really sort of in the transition to Wollstonecraft. I was really having a hard time letting Dickens go. I mean, he just, he was like, he'd become my muse, and I didn't know what I would do without him. And I was researching this one aspect that I knew was important to the novel, and I didn't know how I was going to write it. And I spent like days and days researching and Googling and trying to figure out. And finally I put in the right words. And the first thing that popped up in my feed was a letter Charles Dickens wrote about this very subject.
Are you kidding?
No. And it pointed me exactly to what I needed to write this piece that's so critical to the Wollstonecraft novel.
That's incredible.
I felt like, thank you, Charles Dickens.
He didn't leave you.
Yeah, you're my spirit guide. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm having a coughing attack here. Sorry about that. He didn't leave you.
No.
That's those are those kind of like things that happen in the universe that are just,
they are.
Things that are going on.
Thanks for like telling me exactly where to go. So there is a lot of magic that happens. A lot of it's writing a struggle, but there are those moments of magic, and you have to take them as the gifts that they are.
Yeah. Well, we can't wait for that. So in closing, is there anything, or what do you want people to come away from, or what do you want people to get out of reading Mr. Dickens and his Carol? Is there anything that you want people to take away from the book?
My favorite scene, my favorite scene to write, the scene that honestly still makes me cry when I read it, because I feel like these were, it's outside of me it's not about God, you're amazing, you wrote something so beautiful, but the scene at Warren's Blacking warehouse where he talks about his father going to debtor's prison, and Eleanor tells him, about sort of her own life growing up and the magic of Christmas and the way, that her family drew nearer to each other. And we're reminded of the truth of Christmas, which is the truth of all your books, that despite what is cold and dark in the world, perhaps it is a loving place after all. And that, that's it for me. I mean, that's the little piece of DNA that the rest of the novel comes from. It's really who I am. It's what I believe. It's in Wollstonecraft as well. And it's everywhere in Dickens. It's completely what he was about. So, again, especially in this moment, which this year has been so difficult for people in so many ways. And I hope that this book will, remind them, yes, it's really cold and dark sometimes, but it is a loving place after all. And we can find love in it, and we can be loving in it and get through to the other side.
Yes. Fantastic. This is our last author event of 2020, and it closed on such a wonderful note for me personally. I can't thank you enough for being here with us. This, like I said, is a treasure of a book. It's the perfect time of year to just sit down, and that message that you give to everybody in this and this time is just fantastic. So Samantha, thank you for spending this time with us.
Thank you, Julie. I'm so appreciative.
Really. It was so great. It was so great chatting with you. Everybody have a wonderful holiday. I'm going to take us off of Facebook now, and we will see you all for more author events in the new year. We still have a couple more tea time recommendations, and hopefully we'll see Samantha maybe sometime in May next year again. So with that, good night, everybody.
Merry Christmas.